I refused to see my mother because she accused me of being in love with my stepfather. I have always had a good relationship with my mother, and that didn't change after my parents divorced for personal reasons. However, things took a turn when my stepfather entered our lives. My mother has always been a bit eccentric, but she was never hurtful, and she always made sure my older sister and I felt loved. That changed when she started dating my stepfather. While I got along with him and he respected my privacy, my mother started acting differently. At first, it was subtle things like, "You two spend a lot of time together, and you're getting really friendly." I brushed it off, mostly because I didn't think much of it. My stepfather and I only spent time together when I visited my mom. Yes, we joked around, but it was harmless and never inappropriate. Jokes like, "Looking like death today, huh?" We never got physical. We never poked each other or shared playful touches, as I don't feel comfortable with being touched for personal reasons, and he always respected that boundary. As time passed, my mother's comments became more aggressive. I started to distance myself from both of them to avoid ruining the good relationship we had, though I didn't know what I was doing wrong. One day, my mother invited me over for coffee and cake, and during our conversation, she suddenly asked if I had feelings for my stepfather. I was caught off guard, shocked, and mostly confused. I told her no and asked why she thought that. She said it was because we were too close to just be friends, and she noticed the way he looked at me. I reassured her that, while we got along well, I only saw him as a father figure and didn't feel anything romantic toward him. I also reminded her that Shed always wanted us to get along, but then she got angry, accusing me of lying and insisting she wasn't blind. The conversation escalated, and I stood up, telling her that the whole thing was ridiculous. I left, and she began texting me things like, "I can't believe my own daughter would betray me," among other hurtful things. I didn't respond and talked to my older sister about it. She advised me to not engage with our mother for a while, saying that she thought our mom was acting completely out of character. So I took her advice and stopped visiting and talking to my mother. It's been 2 months of no contact, and today I received a message from her asking if we could meet up to talk about what happened. I'm torn because, on one hand, I don't really want to meet her after everything that's happened, but on the other hand, I'd like to resolve things and hear her side. After a lot of thought, I decided to meet her at a local cafe. When I arrived, she was already sitting at a corner table, her hands wrapped tightly around a steaming mug. The lines on her face seemed deeper, her usually vibrant eyes subdued. She greeted me with a weak smile, and for a moment, I felt a pang of sympathy. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. I nodded, unsure how to start. I decided to let her take the lead, hoping she'd offer an explanation. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened," she began, her voice shaky, and I think I owe you an apology." I blinked in surprise. An apology was the last thing I expected. "I shouldn't have said the things I did," she continued. "But you have to understand I've been feeling so insecure lately. Your stepfather is younger than me, and he's very charming. I guess I let my insecurities get the better of me." Her words hung in the air, and I wasn't sure how to respond. Part of me wanted to forgive her, but another part of me was still hurt. "Mom," I said cautiously, "you accused me of something so hurtful. Do you realize how that made me feel?" She nodded, tears pooling in her eyes. "I do, and am so sorry. I was wrong, but I need you to understand where I was coming from. I'm not trying to justify my actions, but I've been struggling with a lot of things lately. My self-esteem, my place in this family." Her admission caught me off guard. My mother had always seemed so confident, so in control. Seeing her like this, vulnerable and unsure, was unsettling. "I'm willing to try to move past this," I said carefully, "but it's going to take time. You really hurt me, and I need to rebuild that trust." She nodded again, wiping her tears. "I understand, and am willing to do whatever it takes to make things right." The conversation ended on a tentative note. We agreed to take things slow, to rebuild our relationship step by step. But as I walked away from the cafe, I couldn't shake the feeling that something still wasn't quite right. My mother's insecurities explained her behavior to an extent, but there was a lingering doubt in my mind. Was there more to this than she was letting on? Over the next few weeks, I tried to ease back into a relationship with my mother. We started with small gestures, exchanging texts, having brief phone calls. but every interaction felt strained, as if there was an invisible wall between us. My older sister noticed it too. "Do you think Mom is hiding something?" she asked one evening when we were catching up over video chat. I hesitated, not wanting to jump to conclusions. "I don't know. Maybe? It's like she's trying too hard to smooth things over. But something feels off. You should trust your instincts," she said. "If something doesn't feel right, it's worth looking into." I couldn't argue with that. But how could I approach this without making things worse? The last thing I wanted was to spark another conflict. Yet, the gnawing feeling in my gut refused to go away. That weekend, I decided to visit my mother's house. She had been asking me to come by, and I figured it would be a good opportunity to test the waters. My stepfather wasn't home, which made things a bit less awkward. My mother seemed genuinely happy to see me, but the tension lingered just below the surface. As we sat in the living room, sipping tea and making small talk, I noticed her fidgeting with her hands. It was a nervous habit I hadn't seen in years. "Mom, is everything okay?" I asked gently. She looked up, startled, as if I had caught her off guard. "Of course," she said quickly, but her voice wavered. I decided not to press her, but my curiosity was piqued. What was she so anxious about? And why did it feel like there was a storm brewing just beneath the surface of our lives? The following week, my sister and I decided to dig a little deeper. We weren't sure what we were looking for, but we both felt that there were pieces of the puzzle missing. My sister suggested going through some of our mother's old photos and belongings to see if we could find any clues about what might be bothering her. "Do you think she'll be mad if we snoop?" I asked, half joking. "Probably," my sister admitted. "But at this point, I think we need to know what's going on. It's better than sitting around guessing." We waited until our mother was out running errands and let ourselves into her house. The air inside felt heavy, as if the walls themselves were keeping secrets. We started in the attic, a space cluttered with boxes of old photos, letters, and memorabilia. As we sifted through the boxes, a pattern began to emerge. Many of the photos featured our mother with a man we didn't recognize. He appeared in several images spanning years, always smiling and close to her. In some, they looked like a couple. In others, they were part of a larger group. My sister and I exchanged a glance, silently agreeing to keep looking. In one box, we found a stack of letters tied together with a faded ribbon. The handwriting was elegant, but the ink was smudged in places, as if the writer had been crying while penning the words. We read through a few, and it quickly became clear that they were love letters addressed to our mother. They were signed by someone named David. "Do you think this is the guy in the photos?" my sister asked, holding up one of the pictures. "It must be," I said, my mind racing. "But why has she never mentioned him?" "Maybe they had a bad breakup," my sister suggested. "Or maybe he's the reason she's been acting so weird lately." We continued searching, but before we could uncover more, we heard the sound of the front door opening. My sister and I froze, our hearts pounding. "What are you doing up there?" my mother called, her voice sharp. We exchanged a panicked look. There was no way to explain this without confronting her, and we weren't sure we were ready for what might come next. The tension in the air was palpable as my mother's voice echoed up the stairs. "What are you doing up there?" she repeated, her tone sharp and tinged with suspicion. My sister and I froze, exchanging wide-eyed glances. For a moment, it felt like the walls of the attic were closing in on us. "Just looking through old stuff," my sister called down, trying to keep her voice casual. She set the stack of letters back into the box and quickly tied the ribbon around them again. My heart was racing as we scrambled to make everything appear as undisturbed as possible. Footsteps echoed on the stairs, and moments later, our mother appeared in the attic doorway. Her eyes darted from us to the mess of open boxes and scattered photographs. Her expression was a mixture of confusion and anger. "I didn't give you permission to go through my things," she said, her voice low but firm. "We weren't trying to snoop," I said quickly, though my words felt hollow even to me. We found some old pictures and letters, and we got curious." "Curious about what?" she demanded, crossing her arms over her chest. I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. "About David," I said finally, the name feeling strange on my tongue. Her face went pale, and for a moment, she looked as if she might collapse. She steadied herself against the doorframe, her lips pressing into a thin line. "Put everything back where you found it," she said coldly. "Now." "Mom, wait," my sister said, stepping forward. We're not trying to upset you, but it's obvious this is important. Who is David? It's none of your business, she snapped, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and something else, fear maybe? It is our business if it's affecting you, I countered, my frustration bubbling to the surface. You've been acting so strange lately, and we're just trying to understand why. You don't need to understand anything, she said, her voice rising. Just leave it alone. Without another word, she turned and stormed out of the attic, her footsteps heavy as she descended the stairs. My sister and I stood there in stunned silence, the air around us thick with unanswered questions. Over the next few days, my mother's behavior became even more erratic. She avoided us whenever we were around, retreating to her bedroom or finding excuses to leave the house. My sister and I were at a loss. We wanted to confront her, but we also didn't want to push her further away. It wasn't until the following weekend that an opportunity presented itself. My mother had gone out for the evening, and my sister and I decided to return to the attic. We knew it was risky, but the curiosity and worry gnawing at us were too strong to ignore. This time, we searched more thoroughly, combing through every box and envelope. Most of the items were mundane, old family photos, school reports, holiday cards. But tucked away at the bottom of one box, we found something that made our breath catch. It was a small, locked journal. The cover was worn, the leather cracked and faded with age. Do you think it's hers? My sister whispered, running her fingers over the cover. It has to be, I said. But how are we going to open it? After a few minutes of searching, we found a small key taped to the inside of another box. It felt almost too convenient, as if it had been left there deliberately. We exchanged a nervous glance before unlocking the journal. The pages were filled with my mother's neat handwriting, each entry dated. The earliest ones were from years ago, long before my stepfather had entered the picture. As we skimmed through, a story began to unfold, one that was both heartbreaking and deeply unsettling. David, it seemed, had been someone very important to my mother. The entries spoke of their relationship in vivid detail, how they had met, fallen in love, and made plans for a future together. But as the pages progressed, the tone shifted. The entries became darker, filled with fear and uncertainty. There were mentions of arguments, secrets, and something my mother referred to only as the incident. What do you think happened? My sister asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, I said, flipping through the pages. But whatever it was, it really messed her up. The final entry in the journal was dated just a few weeks before my mother had met my stepfather. It was short, just a few lines, but the words sent a chill down my spine. I can't keep running from this. David's gone, but his shadow is still here. I have to find a way to move on. For my girls, for myself. But some things can't be buried forever. We closed the journal, our minds racing. What had happened to David? And why did my mother seem so haunted by his memory? The more we uncovered, the more questions we had. And deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever had happened, it wasn't just in the past. It was still affecting her and, by extension, us. The next morning, my mother confronted us. She must have noticed that her things had been disturbed because her anger was immediate and intense. You went through my journal, she said, her voice trembling with fury. How dare you invade my privacy like that? Mom, we're sorry, my sister said, trying to calm her down. But you've been acting so strange, and we didn't know what else to do. So you decided to betray me? She spat. That journal was private. You had no right. Maybe we didn't, I said, stepping forward. But we found it because we're worried about you. Who was David? And what happened to him? Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought she might break down completely. But then she straightened, her expression hardening. David is none of your concern, she said coldly. What happened is in the past, and that's where it needs to stay. But it's not in the past, is it? My sister said. You're still carrying it with you. It's affecting you, and it's affecting us. For a moment, she just stared at us, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving us standing there with more questions than ever. That night, I couldn't sleep. My mind was racing, replaying everything we had discovered. There were too many loose ends, too many unanswered questions. Who was David? What had happened between him and my mother? And why did she seem so desperate to keep it all hidden? As I lay there in the dark, I made a decision. I wasn't going to let this go. If my mother wouldn't give us answers, would have to find them ourselves. And deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever we uncovered, it was going to change everything. The weight of what my sister and I had uncovered lingered heavily in the days following our confrontation with our mother. Neither of us could shake the feeling that there was something far more significant hiding beneath her anger and pain. Yet, despite our efforts to approach her again, she remained distant, her walls higher than ever. It was my sister who suggested we take a different approach. "If she won't talk to us, maybe someone else will," she said one afternoon as we sat in her apartment. "There has to be someone who knows more about David. We can't be the only ones in the dark." Her idea made sense, but it also presented a challenge. Our mother had always been a private person, and she had kept her past relationships and much of her personal life to herself. Still, we decided to start with the basics. Family members, old friends, anyone who might have been around during the time David was in her life. Our first call was to our aunt, my mother's younger sister, who lived out of state. She had always been more open and easygoing than my mom, and we hoped she might shed some light on the situation. "David?" she repeated when I brought up the name. There was a pause, and I could hear her shifting on the other end of the line. "Wow, I haven't heard that name in years. Why are you asking about him?" "We found some old photos and letters," I explained, careful not to mention the journal. "Mom's been acting off lately, and we think it might have something to do with him." Our aunt sighed, and I could almost picture her rubbing her temples as she always did when she was deep in thought. "David was a big part of your mom's life for a while. They were serious, you know? I thought they'd end up married, but then, well, things got complicated." "Complicated how?" my sister pressed. There was another pause, longer this time. "Look, it's not really my story to tell," our aunt said finally. "But I will say this. David wasn't who he seemed to be. Your mom found out the hard way, and it broke her. She's been carrying that pain ever since." Before we could ask any more questions, she changed the subject, steering the conversation toward lighter topics. It was clear she wasn't willing to say more, at least not over the phone, but her words only deepened the mystery. What had David done, and why had it left such a lasting scar on our mother? The next lead came unexpectedly. While rummaging through more old boxes in the attic, this time with our mother's reluctant permission, we found a small stack of photographs that appeared to be from a trip. The images were faded, but we recognized our mother immediately. She looked younger, happier, her smile wide and genuine in a way we hadn't seen in years. Beside her in several of the photos was a man we assumed to be David. He was tall with dark hair and a confident, almost mischievous grin. On the back of one photo, scrawled in my mother's handwriting, was the name of a place, Cedar Lake. Neither my sister nor I had ever heard of it, but a quick search revealed it to be a small town about 3 hours' drive from where we lived. "We have to go," my sister said immediately. "If they spent time there, maybe someone remembers them. Maybe we can find out what happened." I hesitated, torn between my curiosity and a nagging sense of guilt. "Do you think we should tell Mom?" I asked. "And have her shut us down again?" My sister replied, "No way. She'll just tell us to drop it." She wasn't wrong. So the following weekend, we set off for Cedar Lake, armed with little more than the photographs and a determination to uncover the truth. Cedar Lake was a picturesque town, its streets lined with charming shops and cafes. It was the kind of place that seemed frozen in time, untouched by the hustle and bustle of the outside world. As we wandered through the town, asking questions and showing the photos to locals, we were met mostly with polite smiles and shrugs. No one seemed to recognize our mother or David. Just as we were about to give up, a woman in her 60s approached us outside a small diner. "Excuse me," she said, her eyes narrowing as she studied the photo in my hand. "Is that Sarah? Sarah Mitchell?" "Yes," I said, surprised. "You know her?" The woman nodded, a wistful smile tugging at her lips. "I used to. She and David came here a few times. I worked at the inn they stayed at." "Do you remember anything about them?" my sister asked eagerly. "Anything that might help us understand what happened?" The woman's smile faded, and she glanced around as if to make sure no one was listening. "I don't like to gossip," she said quietly, "but there were rumors. People said David wasn't. Well, he wasn't honest with your mother about who he was, what he did. There was an incident, something that happened during one of their visits. After that, they stopped coming." "What kind of incident?" I pressed, my heart pounding. The woman hesitated, then shook her head. I'm sorry. That's all I know. But if you're looking for answers, you might try the old inn. It's still there, and the owner, Tom, might remember more. We thanked her and headed straight for the inn, our anticipation growing with each step. The building was quaint, its weathered facade giving it a cozy, welcoming feel. Inside, we found Tom, a man in his 70s with a sharp memory and a kind demeanor. When we showed him the photos, he nodded immediately. I remember them, he said. Sarah and David. They seemed happy at first, but there was something off about him. He had this way of charming everyone, but it felt calculated, like he always had an angle. What happened? My sister asked. Tom's expression grew somber. One night, there was a fight, a bad one. I don't know what it was about, but Sarah left in tears. David stayed behind, and the next morning, he was gone. I never saw either of them again. His words hung in the air, heavy with implications. What had caused the fight, and why had David disappeared? As we thanked Tom and left the inn, my sister and I were left with more questions than answers. That evening, as we drove back home, I couldn't stop replaying everything we had learned. It felt like we were piecing together a puzzle, but so many pieces were still missing. What had David done to make my mother leave so suddenly? And why had she been so determined to bury the past? The answers felt closer than ever, but I couldn't shake the feeling that uncovering them would come at a cost, one we might not be ready to pay. The drive home from Cedar Lake was quiet, each of us lost in our thoughts. The pieces we had gathered so far painted a vague but troubling picture, a relationship marked by secrets and an abrupt, painful ending. But as close as we were to the truth, we couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease. Whatever had happened with David, it had left scars on our mother, scars she had never wanted us to see. We need to confront her, my sister said finally, breaking the silence. No more digging behind her back. If we want answers, we have to hear them from her. I nodded, though my stomach churned at the thought. It wasn't just the fear of another argument, it was the fear of what those answers might reveal. When we arrived home, our mother was in the kitchen, washing dishes. She looked up as we entered, her face a mixture of surprise and wariness. You're back early, she said, drying her hands on a dish towel. We need to talk, my sister said, her tone firm but not unkind. Our mother's eyes flickered between us, and she sighed. Let me guess. You've been digging into the past again? We went to Cedar Lake, I said, deciding there was no point in beating around the bush. We talked to some people who remembered you and David. Her expression hardened, and for a moment, I thought she might shut us down again. But then her shoulders slumped, and she gestured for us to sit down. If you want to know the truth, she said quietly, I suppose it's time you heard it. She began hesitantly, her words measured as if she were afraid of saying too much too quickly. David, she explained, had been her first great love. They had met at a party through mutual friends, and their connection had been immediate. He was charming, she said, a faint, bittersweet smile touching her lips. He had this way of making you feel like you were the only person in the room. But as their relationship progressed, cracks began to appear. David had a darker side, one he hid well in public, but which surfaced in private. He was controlling, jealous, and prone to sudden, inexplicable mood swings. At first, she dismissed these as the byproducts of stress or insecurity, but over time, his behavior grew more erratic. The night of the fight at Cedar Lake, she said, her voice trembling slightly, was the night I realized I couldn't stay with him. We had been arguing for days about something trivial. I don't even remember what. But that night, he accused me of cheating on him, out of nowhere. He was furious, and I was scared. I packed my things and left while he was still shouting. What happened after that? My sister asked gently. I thought I'd never see him again, she said. But he found me. He showed up at my apartment weeks later, begging for forgiveness. He seemed different, calmer, and I almost believed he had changed. But then, she hesitated, her hands clenching into fists. Then I found out the truth about him. The truth? I prompted, leaning forward. She took a deep breath, as if steeling herself for what she was about to say. David wasn't who he claimed to be. He had been living under a false identity. I found documents, passports, things that didn't match the man I thought I knew. He was involved in illegal activities, fraud, theft, things I couldn't even begin to understand at the time. Her voice broke, and she paused to collect herself. I confronted him about it, and he didn't deny it. He just smiled like it was some kind of game. That was when I knew I had to cut him out of my life completely. I moved, changed my number, and told everyone to never mention him to me again. "Why didn't you tell us?" my sister asked, her voice thick with emotion. "Why keep all of this a secret?" "Because I didn't want you to see me as weak," she admitted, tears streaming down her face. I was so ashamed of myself for falling for someone like him, for not seeing the signs, and I didn't want a shadow hanging over our family. I thought if I buried it deep enough, it would stay buried. Derum was silent for a long time after she finished. I felt a strange mix of emotions: sadness for what she had endured, anger at David for what he had done, and guilt for forcing her to relive it all. "Mom," I said finally, "we're not here to judge you. We just wanted to understand. And now that we do, we can. We can move forward together." She looked at me, her eyes filled with a vulnerability I had never seen before. "Do you mean that?" "Of course," my sister said, reaching across the table to take her hand. "You're our mom. We love you, no matter what." The three of us sat there holding hands as the weight of the past began to lift. It wouldn't be easy to move on. Healing never is. But for the first time in years, it felt possible. Over the weeks that followed, our family began to rebuild. My mother started seeing a therapist to work through her lingering trauma, and my sister and I made a conscious effort to spend more time with her. The shadow of David lingered, but it no longer felt insurmountable. Together, we were stronger than the pain he had caused. In the end, the truth hadn't broken us. It had brought us closer, reminding us of the resilience we shared and the love that had always been there, waiting to be rediscovered.